Hi and welcome back. Lots of people have asked me about my voiceover chain, so I thought I'd show you what I'm using. My setup hasn't always been the same, but it hasn't changed significantly over the last 3 or 4 years, so the chain I'm going to show you is the one I've used for almost all the videos on this channel. However, before we get into it, and at the risk of spoilers, the only one secret magic ingredient is my voice. I'm lucky to have a voice that people seem to like listening to, along with an accent that lends an air of authority. And if you don't sound like me off mic, you're not going to sound like me on mic either. As a demonstration of that fact, I'm not actually using my normal voiceover chain at the moment. So far in this video, I've been speaking into an old and battered SM58, plugged into a Focusrite Scarlett 2i2 interface, and processed only using Reaper stock plugins. Now I'm on my usual voiceover chain. Yes, it sounds better. There is a reason why we don't just use 58s for everything in the studio. But the sound from the 58 was fine, in my opinion. And if you're listening on your phone, you probably didn't know anything was different until I told you. I still sounded like me, right? So I'll start by showing you my normal setup that I'm using now. Then I'll switch back to the 58 at the end and show you my stock plugin chain as well. Okay, let's start with the mic, which is a bit unusual, and you can't buy one quite like it. It's made by 3U Audio, and it's a Warbler 4 model. But it's not like the ones advertised on their website. There's no voicing switch, for a start, and there are no markings on the body at all, not even to label the high-pass filter and pad switches. I've had to use Sparky tape and a Sharpie to label them, and also to mark this out as the 4 model, because I also have a similarly plainclothes Warbler 2. 3U audio mics aren't available in the UK, as far as I'm aware. Certainly they weren't at the time I bought mine. So when I stumbled across these on eBay, after reading much praise for them online, I decided to take a punt. And I'm very happy I did, as both mics sound great and have been very useful. Anyway, I've added a Rycote shock mount and pop shield combo, and I get right up close to it. You probably guessed that part, but I'll say it explicitly anyway, because it's important. Getting close to the mic does several things, which I'll address one by one. First of all, it boosts the low frequencies due to proximity effect. Those of you who thought I was boosting and compressing the bass frequencies were quite wrong. In fact, I do the opposite, really. I have to tame the low end with high-pass filters to prevent it from getting too boomy. But I try to leave enough of it in to give that warm, intimate, late-night radio type of sound. Next, getting close gives me a better signal-to-noise ratio. Voice recordings tend to need a lot of gain, especially if you're relatively softly spoken like me, so the noise floor of your studio can become an issue. Fortunately, my room is nice and quiet, but I'm making quite specific types of videos that usually involve audio examples. I don't want background noise from my mic interfering with those in any way, so I tend to mute my audio when I'm not speaking. As background noise tends to be much more noticeable if it stops and starts rather than runs continuously, I make a special effort to keep the noise levels as low as I possibly can. Third, it reduces the room sound. Of course, you don't want lots of echoing, untreated room smearing up your voice. And if you're recording in that kind of room, getting up close to the mic probably isn't going to fix the issue, though it might help a bit. But let's assume you're in a moderately treated room that sounds nicely balanced and isn't too lively. In that case, you can get a decent distance from the mic and it will still sound fine. That would be unavoidable if I were talking to a camera, and in that case it would seem quite appropriate to hear a little hint of the room that you can see in the background. But of course I'm not talking into a camera, I'm just a disembodied voice. The voice in your head, if you like. And it seems to me that the more I eliminate the sound of the room I'm in, the better I create that impression. There are also downsides to getting up close, however. Plosive B's and P's can hit the capsule too hard, even through the pop shield. K sounds can end up super hard and clicky. And I pick up lots of unwanted lip-smacking ticks and funny little clicky sounds that then need editing out afterwards. I have 2 methods to mitigate these problems. First, I consciously try to eliminate them from my performance, softening my B's and P's and K's whenever I remember to. And I monitor on good quality headphones, turned up quite loud, so when I forget and hit a K sound too hard, I'm usually aware of it and can redo that line a bit more gently. And second, I keep my mouth slightly off-axis to the mic capsule. Partly this is just because I need to turn my head to read the script off my phone, and I'm close enough to the mic so this makes a difference. But I also place the mic a little higher than you might expect, about nose height, angled down to pick up more of my chest resonances along with my voice. The mic is plugged into a DAV BG1 preamp. Not much to say here. It adds gain, and I have a gentle high-pass filter switched in, as well as the one on the mic. That goes to an aging RME multiface line-in, and thence into Reaper, usually at 48 kHz and always 24-bit. And here's my plug-in chain. I'm slightly embarrassed by how many plugins I'm using. It seems like overkill, really, but none of them are doing anything too extreme. So first up, the most important, the EQ. And this is the only one that's arguably doing a lot. Although do note my graph scale is set to 6 dB. This looks less alarming with the default 12 dB setting. Nevertheless, it's more EQ than I would normally want to use for a voiceover. Generally speaking, I would aim to pick a mic that sounds right in the first place and only needs a high-pass filter. In fact, I have other mics in my collection that tick that box. But I still prefer the sound of this mic with the EQ, so I break my own rules and continue to use it. Here's how it sounds totally flat. Now with the high-pass filter, which is much steeper than those in the mic and preamp, and is set to gently tame the low boomy part of my voice, as well as remove subsonic rubbish. The high shelf adds some air and presence, as the mic is quite warm sounding without it. The low mid-cut reduces muddiness and increases clarity, while the higher mid-cut dips down the nasal region and stops it becoming hard and brittle without the lower mid-range to balance it. Okay, next, a gate. My noise floor is already pretty low without it, as you can hear if I bypass. But I duck it down by another 12 dB just to be on the safe side. I'm using some look ahead, so the gate opens just before I start to speak, and I've got 50 milliseconds of hold, so it doesn't start to close until just after I've stopped speaking. And consequently, the gain modulation shouldn't be touching the vocal at all, and I don't feel any need to use oversampling in this case. Okay, next, a declicker. This is just lazy, really. I should deal with the clicks individually, and that's how I used to do it. But I make so many of them that fixing them in post is a real chore. So I've found some declicker settings that deal with about 90% of them automatically, and don't seem to do too much harm otherwise, and this saves me a lot of tedious cleanup work. Okay, now power. This is mostly for the leveler section, which evens out the loudness and saves me having to automate this in post. Basically, I have an unfortunate tendency to eat the ends of my words, and the last syllable of a phrase often ends up inaudible. Power is set to do a very subtle 2 dB of levelling, but that's 2 dB up and down, so there's really 4 dB of gain riding, which is enough to stop the ends of my words disappearing, while never becoming too obvious and noticeable. I also have a touch of compression going on, but this is very gentle and just aims to soften hard consonant sounds slightly. As much as I love compression in general, I hate hearing it on my voice, so I only use just enough to keep my performance under control, and I keep the settings as transparent as possible. That said, the next plugin is another compressor, and it looks like it's spanking me quite hard. But notice the gain settings. The dry level is at unity, while the wet signal is in negative numbers. So this is actually fairly subtle parallel compression, giving a gentle upward compression effect. And this finishes the job of keeping the ends of my sentences from tailing off too much and becoming inaudible. I've turned on oversampling for this one because theoretically these settings could result in aliasing otherwise, but I'll be honest, I can't hear a difference in this case. Okay, a de-esser. I can't say the Fabfilter is the best de-esser, as I haven't tried them all, but I can say it's the best de-esser I've ever tried. In many cases, all you have to do is load it up, and the default settings will just magically work. And I think that may be what I've done in this case, except once again I've enabled oversampling because I'm modulating high frequencies, and this could cause aliasing. And I finish all that off with a limiter. Pro L, set to its safe style for minimum distortion, and just shaving a dB or two off the very loudest peaks. This voiceover usually still needs to be mixed with audio examples or intro and outro music, however, so I leave myself 6 dB of peak headroom on the output, rather than pushing it up near full scale. I'll do that right at the end with another limiter on the master bus that's processing the mix of my voice plus any background music. And although we've reached the end of my voiceover chain, there's still another important plugin to consider. Everything except my voice goes through a ducker plugin, which is usually Pro G in ducking mode, which is keyed from my voice and turns down the music whenever I speak. This usually does quite a lot of ducking, typically 9 dB, which I find is the most I can get away with without it becoming too obvious and distracting. Even so, I need to be a bit careful with it. Sometimes I'll start speaking just after a transient in the music, like a snare drum or something, and you'll hear the ducking clamp down on the transient and choke it as if it were compressed way too hard. In that case, I'll need to shift my voice a tiny bit earlier or later to fix it. Okay, let's go back to the 58. But the Scarlett is back plugged into our living room PC, so I can play guitars through the hi-fi, and I can't be bothered to retrieve it again. So this time I'm plugged into the same DAV preamp I usually use for the condenser mic. And honestly, I haven't felt the need to change any of my processing to compensate. Here's my EQ, not too different to the usual mic, to be honest. I've had to stack up two 12 dB high-pass filters to achieve a 24 dB per octave roll-off. And the high shelf is tuned much higher, as the 58 has plenty of upper mid-range already. On the other hand, I needed 6 dB of high shelf boost right at the top, compared to just 3 and a bit for the usual mic. Okay, next is regate, to drop the noise floor a bit. Honestly, regate frustrates me in not having a range control. That's essential in a gate, in my opinion. I've mimicked the effect by mixing in some dry signal and dropping the wet level a touch to compensate. But this is fiddly and annoying, if you ask me, and shouldn't be necessary. Moving on, this recomp is performing the same function as the power leveler in my usual setup. I've got a whole 400 milliseconds of RMS window, plus a high-pass filter to get as close as possible to the momentary loudness setting I use in PowerAir. And I'm using a fairly high ratio with the threshold set carefully so it doesn't squash more than a handful of decibels, plus a healthy dose of look-ahead. Honestly, a range control would be useful in this plugin as well, though it's not as vital as having one in a gate. I thought I would spice things up next with an 1175 plugin, now that it's working as intended again. But notice the mix slider is mostly over at the dry end, so this is subtle parallel compression again. Next, a recomp, set up for de-essing using the sidechain filters. This works well enough. Full band de-essing often sounds more natural than only ducking the sibilant region, and this is also how I run Pro DS, so I don't feel any need for anything more complex. But while this was reasonably easy to set up, it still took an order of magnitude longer than just loading a Pro DS and going with the default settings, which is what happens half the time I use it. Okay, finally, another recomp, this time set up as a final limiter with a touch of look ahead. This isn't really equivalent to a Pro L2 in any way, but in this case I'm just kissing the top dB or 2 of the peaks, and it works fine. There's no declicking in this setup. Maybe there's a JS plugin that can do that. Let me know in the comments. But I'll be declicking it manually for this video. I'm not going to show you how, but maybe there's scope for an editing and spectral editing video in future. Again, comment if you'd be interested in that. Anyway, that's all for now. I'm going to sign off on this dented and much gigged 58 and say thanks for watching.